Thank you for joining us for this third and last panel of the day. As Juliet very kindly mentioned, it's going to be about the war in Ukraine, more specifically about the gender dynamics surrounding the violent conflict. We've got 3 speakers here in person, one speaker joining us via a pre-recorded message as well. The speakers, in order of their presentations, are going to be, first of all, Dr. Anna Dolidze, who is a lead researcher in policing and security at Rabdon Academy in the United Arab Emirates. Via the pre-recorded presentation, we're going to be joined by Dr. Anna Kvit, who's a visiting research fellow at University College London. As Juliet very kindly mentioned, Marianna Derevianko very kindly has joined us here from Ukraine, where she works as a police major and senior inspector in the National Police Force of Ukraine. And then last, but by no means least, we're also joined by Dr. Jennifer Mathis, who's a senior lecturer in the Department of International Politics at Aberystwyth University. So you're probably familiar with this already from the preceding panels. The structure we're going to follow is that each speaker, either present in the room or via the pre-recorded message, is going to give a 5 to 10 minute presentation. After that, we're going to have an informal conversation amongst the panel. And after that, we're going to open for the floor, both for those of you who are here in person and those of you who are joining online, to raise any questions or comments that you might have. And on that note, I'm going to hand over right away to Dr. Anna Dolidze.
Okay, excellent. First of all, thank you to SecurityWomen for having us here. It's a great pleasure and privilege and opportunity for me to address this audience, to be in London right now, and to engage with my fellow panelists and conference participants. My name is Anna Dolidze. I currently teach in UAE, but previously I'm a senior government official from a number of positions in the Republic of Georgia. Originally, my profession is a scholar of international law. So in addition to teaching and doing activist public interest work, I research international law and gender. And just to flag one of my biggest achievements in the tenure, I think, as a Deputy Defense Minister of Georgia, is to open up the only and highly prestigious military school for women as well. Prior to our leadership in the ministry, the school was only accessible to boys, and it's a publicly funded, highly prestigious military high school that leads then to military university and then military career. And just to start off with a story, when we, the ministry leadership, made the decision to open up the school, having discovered that it was only for boys, from the day of establishment, 2004, of course, it was met, as every change does, it was met with a lot of resistance, question marks, laughs, cynicism, and my favorite phrase, "It's not possible." And the most important thing that was told to us from various levels was, no, Georgian families will not allow their daughters to go to a military school. Georgian fathers would not want a military daughter. None of that backed up by science, of course. None of that backed up by empirics or evidence or anything like this, or even public opinion polls with which you could support this. What happened, as was envisaged, as we envisaged, as the school was opened up, there was a flood of families with their daughters, accompanying them to sit for the exams. Of course, quite logical, because it's a highly prestigious, funded school which provides for a career. So that's a success story now. It still has girls every year as graduates, as freshmen, and fresh women. Now, I have an important task of outlining of what are broadly the impacts of breakdown of law and order, and I'm sure this audience, which is composed of people who are practitioners as well as scholars themselves and people who have experienced war firsthand, this audience knows very well what are those impacts. But I will outline a couple of things, and most importantly, perhaps, I would outline what I have found as someone who had personal encounter to war as a child, as well as a professional, as a leader, what I have found as an interesting point of resource in terms of dealing with the impact of war. So first and foremost, from a personal point, those of you who don't know and shouldn't know the history of very small country of Georgia very well, in the recent 3 decades in my lifetime, we have experienced 3 wars, first civil war that every one of my generation has experienced as a kid. So my dad was an opposition member at the time during the military coup, which, with the help and aid of Russia, deposed a legitimately elected first president. And he was arrested. He was a political prisoner. So I have seen firsthand, as all of my compatriots, impacts of civil war, secessionist war, war by proxy conducted by Russia of different generations. Something then we later see, of course, in Ukraine that could have been envisaged if we had been careful in looking at how Russia operates and how what's its strategies in terms of reclaiming the territories of former empire. So war is probably a phenomenon which doesn't have a silver lining. Most things have silver linings. War is something that once you experience it, it's hard to think of a silver lining to a war. If we can only think of the 60,000, Marianna was saying this morning, 60,000 orphaned kids in Ukraine, 60,000. That's the population of Luxembourg and Monaco combined, so two sovereign countries are orphan, only orphan, not to speak of the dead on the Ukrainian side as well as Russian side, the material impact, emotional impact. So war is a grave trauma, the impact of which then, of course, is felt a couple of generations later. This is very important. So you might meet people in countries that have experienced war. You might think, oh, well, this is a normal person. They're vibrant. They have their inner child flourishing. They're having fun. But in fact, the trauma of war is probably lurking somewhere in them. And as we know from the research on trauma, from a great book from Bessel van der Kolk, trauma can be passed through generations, 2 or 3 generations down, through psychology and brain as well as through body. So growing up with my grandmother who had experienced Second World War and thinking about the topic of trauma, I realized even just how we eat nowadays in some of the families whose grandparents were in Second World War is impacted by the Second World War. What we eat, and how we approach the idea of scarcity and loss. Okay, so in terms of 3 aspects that I would like to say in terms of war. First and most important is the distributional effects of war. So all phenomena have distributional effect. They will affect individuals to different degrees, and the more you're vulnerable, the more war will affect you. We know this from stories, from narratives, from research as well. So women and children, elderly people, people with disability, they will be most severely affected by all phenomena, especially by such a traumatic event as war is. Therefore, it's even more important that these groups of people have their voice expressed somewhere. Narratives, stories, political decision-making. Distributional effects are felt incredibly in terms of violence inflicted on people and inflicted in societies even after the war is over, without relevant, and which is often impossible, psychological assistance and support in a war-torn context. Violence is manifested and is basically a daily routine occurrence in our societies. Yeah. Second is the impact of war is going to be felt not only in areas directly affected by war, but also in areas which are supposedly not affected. The story of Georgia and Abkhazia war and South Ossetian war in 93-94 is a good example of this. The large-scale displaced population, displaced into the capital, competition for jobs, competition for resources, high level of stress, large-scale immigration from the country. That's where all the collateral effects and damages of the war. Of course, in terms of collateral effects are the effects on social fabric and change of gender roles, reconfiguring of gender roles, understanding what the end of war means for men and for women, what the end of lost war means for men and for women. These are different things. Sometimes women, and in Georgian case, there have been studies of internally displaced people, how they've shown, mostly women, how they have shown resilience to cope with the war effect. They've taken more important economic roles. Currently, Georgia, it seriously depends on remittances. What do you think these remittances are from? They're mostly from women immigrants, Georgian immigrants that are working in Western Europe and the United States and sending money back as a coping mechanism to the devastating economy after the war. And my last and more optimistic point, not to repeat what we all know and we all anyways think of. So there are no recipes, of course, to deal with the effects of war, but one important thing, of course, is to always end with the story of victory. It's incredibly important. End with the story of victory. Even if you've lost the war, you have to end with the story of victory. Personal victory, family victory, country victory, nation victory. This is something that is incredibly at the point when war has brought devastating impact. People are suffering victimhood. Narratives of victory and winning and perseverance are incredibly empowering from the personal level to the national level. And what helps in the narratives of victory is finding what Ken Robinson calls the element, the most significant point of resource in a person or in a nation which can change everything around. Each nation has an element, each person has an element. This is something that a nation, a community, ethnicity, a group of people, an individual, there's something that they're great about and could be used as a point of leverage to turn the story around and turn the story of trauma and destruction into a story of survival and hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's great. Thank you very much for these very insightful conceptual and theoretical points, of course, with reference to Georgia, about gendered effects and dynamics of war. At this point, I'm not sure which direction of AV I should look. At this point, we have over there, the pre-recorded presentation by Dr. Anna Kvit, who very kindly is going to give us a historical overview of gender dynamics in the Ukrainian armed forces.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anna Kvit, and I'm a visiting research fellow at the University College London. The main area of my research is women in the military of Ukraine. Since 2015, I have co-authored a series of research projects on women in the military sector in Ukraine, named Invisible Battalion. It was first public empirical research in this area in Ukraine, and some of the studies contributed to the changes of the gender equality policies in the military sector of Ukraine. I have also worked for international organizations promoting implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda in Ukraine since the beginning of Russia's war against Ukraine in 2014. And today I would like to tell you about the role of women in the Ukrainian military, how it has changed over the recent years, and how these changes affect Ukrainian military. According to the information of the Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, in spring 2023, there were about 60,000 of women serving and working in the Ukrainian armed forces. 42,000 of women are currently service women, not civilians, and the other 18,000 are civilian women who work in the armed forces of Ukraine. And a little bit more, at least according to the official data, than 5,000 women are currently serving on the front line. These are the highest numbers of women in the military Ukraine has ever had. Currently, it is higher than in any other European army, including largest European armies of UK, France, and Italy. The ratio of women in the armed forces of Ukraine is classified at the moment, but before the full-scale invasion in 2022, women comprised approximately 17% of the military personnel, which is again higher than the average representation of women in NATO armies. It is important to mention that women were present in the armed forces of Ukraine since Ukraine's independence in 1991 and even during the Soviet times. Ukrainian women were serving in the Soviet army and in the Ukrainian insurgent army during and after the Second World War. The beginning of Russia's war against Ukraine in 2014 and its escalation in 2022 led to the massive voluntary conscription of women to the armed forces of Ukraine. Since 2014, number of service women in the armed forces of Ukraine has increased almost 3 times, and number of women officers has increased almost 5 times. How these numbers are related to the actual roles of women in the Ukrainian military. Well, first of all, the new female role in Ukrainian society is emerging. It is a role of woman defender. Over the last 10 years, women received access to all positions, including combat positions in the armed forces of Ukraine. There are no more prohibited professions for women like it was in 2014, and it is reflected in the actual positions occupied by women in the military. Compared to 2014, nowadays women have more rights in the defense sector of Ukraine. It became easier for women to receive veteran status as well, and access to services provided for veterans. During this ongoing war, military education became fully available for women, which in the future should facilitate the career development of women in the military sector of Ukraine. There is a political will and civil society demand for the improvement of women's rights in the military sector. The principles of gender equality are reflected in national laws and programs, such as the National Action Plan on implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, Women, Peace and Security. Infrastructure for gender equality is developing as well. For example, a female military uniform has been introduced this year for the first time. More positions for gender advisors are introduced in the institutions of defense and security sector. There is still place for improvement of gender equality policies and their implementation in the sector, but we can also see that the necessary changes are gradually happening. Except for the policy change and numerical representation of women in the armed forces of Ukraine, there are also changes in the perception of women in the armed forces of Ukraine and in the media representation of women in the armed forces of Ukraine. Visibility of women in the armed forces is increasing in the media and in communication materials of defense sector. The National Day of Defenders was renamed into the Day of Men and Women Defenders, which is a very symbolic gesture that highlights women's presence and contribution to the defense of Ukraine. The way media are writing about military women is changing as well. If 9 years ago and even 7 years ago they were writing about the very fact of women's presence in the military sector, nowadays they use more critical approach, highlighting their roles, motivation and challenges women are facing in the military. A perception of women in the military and women's roles is changing in the Ukrainian society as well. In 2018, according to the all-national survey of adult population, only 53% of population thought that women and men should have equal rights in the armed forces of Ukraine. Whereas in 2023, attitudes have changed dramatically, and nowadays approximately 85% of adult population of Ukraine are supporting the idea that women should be granted equal opportunities with men to work in the armed forces of Ukraine and other military formations. It is important to mention that these changes in the visibility and perception of women in the military are happening during the ongoing war. What will happen in the post-war period, it is yet unknown. To conclude, women in Ukraine's military are actively contributing to the defense of the country during the ongoing war, and their contribution is getting more recognized. They voluntarily join the army. They perform different roles in the military, not only the more traditional so-called support roles like cleric or psychologist, but also combat roles as well. Women gradually start to be represented in the decision-making positions in the defense sector of Ukraine. Their active and voluntary involvement into the defense sector is also contributing to the changes of the military culture in Ukraine by transforming policies and norms in a more women-friendly way.
I know Anna isn't here, but maybe in absence. Thank you for that presentation. And Marianna very kindly is going to build on Anna's insights to share her experience.
Thank you very much. Dear friends, thank you very much for invitation. For me, it's an honor to speak before you today, to represent Ukraine and to take part at this conference that joins the women of security sector from different parts of the whole world. Since the beginning of full-scale invasion of Russia, the Ukrainian law enforcement system has faced a large number of new threats caused by the tragic consequences of the war, which has been a real test of the strength for all of us. Units of the system of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, National Police of Ukraine, State Border Guard Service, National Guard of Ukraine, State Emergency Service, working unitedly around the clock, were able to withstand and continue to effectively counter the threats caused by war, and made up approximately 25% of the security and defense forces of Ukraine. Please, next slide. The experience that gained by Ukrainian policemen, rescuers, and border guard during this time is really unique. Mass evacuation of millions of citizens, especially children and elderly, more than 6 million people became internally displaced, demining, the occupation and reintegration of occupied territories, maintenance of law and order in the frontline areas, experience in the investigation of war crimes in the condition of a full-scale war. The police recorded more than 97,000 of war crimes that were committed by the Russians. After the deoccupation of our territories, found 79 places where the Russians legally detained and tortured Ukrainian citizens, 21 mass burials, which more than 1,000 bodies of murdered civilians and soldiers were exhumed. Please, next slide. At each of the stages of the implementation of this important task, a significant role is played by Ukrainian female law enforcement officers, who were able to demonstrate effective work, flexibility, and readiness to perform their duties in spite of the existence of various risks and threats in the current conditions of a full-scale invasion. They make a great contribution to ensuring law and order, protecting the rights and freedoms of Ukrainian citizens at this time, as well as achieving victory for Ukraine in the war. Female police officers serve and perform assigned tasks in the conditions of constant threat. They directly perform tasks in the combat zone in special police units. As a part of a group of forensic experts, they examine the sites of rocket attacks, destruction of infrastructure, and deaths of civilians. The effective policy of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine in the field of implementation of gender policy influenced the increase in the number of female police officers. Today, more than 27% of the total number of police officers are women. And I want to tell you about another unit in the structure of the National Police of Ukraine. It's the Petrol Police Department. Maybe previous slide, if it's possible. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a Petrol Police Department which was formed in 2015 during the reform of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. And as we see, the representatives of women staff in this unit is 25%. And since the beginning of the war, female police officers also faced new tasks, helped to clear the rubble of buildings after missile strikes and artillery shelling, guard duty at roadblocks and critical infrastructure, and so ensuring public safety and order in the city and towns on the front line and on the occupied territories. Also provide first aid to people injured as a result of the hostilities, evacuate and escort citizens from combat areas and occupied territories, checking person IDs, inspecting items and vehicles, baggage and cargo, and also escort military cargo. As a member of a Ukrainian Association of Women in Law Enforcement, that was founded in 2018. I just want to say that the role of this organization is very important. It is the first in Ukraine that unites representatives of various, next slide. Sorry. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. It's the first one in Ukraine, such association that was founded in March 2018. And you know that this association unites representatives of various law enforcement agencies for the implementation of gender-sensitive policies and practices in the security sector. Please, next slide. You can see the mission and the vision of the association. The mission is to be a leader in achieving national and global objectives on gender equality by increasing the role and professionalism of women in law enforcement agencies of Ukraine. And the vision to create a gender-balanced and gender-sensitive environment in law enforcement agencies of Ukraine, thus contributing to the provision of gender-oriented services in communities. Thank you. And also I just want to add that the association is aimed at forming and confirming the image of female law enforcement officers as a leader, professional and specialist in her field. Also, since the beginning of the full-scale war in Ukraine, the Ukrainian Association has adopted its activities in accordance with the conditions of the time and needs of its members. And in order to ensure the safety of children and the families of law enforcement officers, the association organized their evacuation to safe place, both in Ukraine and abroad. Honestly, the men and women, not only police officers, also the representatives from whole security sector need assistance, need help. I mean, not help, it's better support. They need psychological support, they need socialization, they need medical support. And that's why we are really ready to share our experience in the areas we have made progress. But we will be also grateful for the opportunity to learn more from your experience on these issues we are currently working on and we will continue to work in the future. I just want to say gratitude to all counterparties that assist us in this fighting. Especially, thank you very much for for your help to all United Nations. To all United Kingdom and in other countries. Your help is one of the key factors in overcoming the challenges facing Ukraine in achieving peace, freedom, and democracy in the whole world. I thank everyone who stands by us. We must continue to be united force. Ukraine needs your support both now and in the process of recovery after our victory. Thank you for support. Together we are powerful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marianna. And now Jennifer is going to shift our empirical focus a little bit by giving us some insights into gender dynamics in Russia.
Exactly. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you today. I think what we've heard both from Marianna and from Anna Kvit is very inspiring stories about the way that women have increasingly been integrated into the security services, into the armed forces, and the material difference that they make. And this is vitally important. But I want to argue that they also make a difference when it comes to symbolism. Because by integrating women into the security forces, sorry, I don't know why this is doing this, Ukraine is basically saying, we are in favor of gender equality. we share the values of Europe and North America and the West, right? This is who we are. This is our identity. This is our intention for our society during the war and afterwards as well, right? Now, I want to talk about a case that's very different. I want to talk about a case of a regime and a country, a regime in particular, where everything depends upon keeping women out of positions of authority in the security services. I want to talk about Russia. Can we have the slide that I sent? There we go, good. I only brought one slide because that's the only one we need. The association of a particular kind of masculinized strength with Russia is very fundamental to Putin's regime. It starts with Putin himself. He presents himself as a particular kind of a strong man, a particular kind of a strong leader. Strong man, strong leader equals strong state, right? And so for Russia to be strong in this sense, it needs to have very strong and masculinized security services. So the armed forces, the police, the intelligence services, and so on. And you can see from this image, which is from a recent Russian military recruitment video, which emphasized masculinity, that this is the image that Russia is putting forward of its armed forces to its own society, as well as to the wider world. So in this ad, if you haven't seen it, I commend it to you as a quite horrifying example. It shows 3 Russian men who are dissatisfied with their civilian lives and their civilian jobs, and they're being told, is this all there is for you? And then they appear wearing soldiers' uniforms, and they're given this message: "You're a man, be one." And this is the message. So it's very important. In other words, it's vitally important for Putin's regime, for the way that he is fighting this war in Ukraine, that the armed forces and the security services not be identified with women. Women in Russia are routinely described as the weak sex. Routinely described as the weak sex. With no apology, no sense of irony, it's absolutely straightforward, right? And the idea that the state, which has so much invested in being strong, defined in a particular way, would rely upon the weakness of women to defend the state and to promote its values abroad is quite almost comical, right? So absolutely, it is not in Russia's interest to present women as being important to security and defense. In fact, it's an interesting fact that Russia and Ukraine have very similar numbers of women in their armed forces. But whereas Ukraine promotes women's military service, it's changed its policies and its laws to open up different roles, in fact, all roles to women. It routinely refers to women and men defenders of the country. Russia does exactly the opposite. It has changed no laws and policies to open up roles to women. It basically conceals, to a very large extent, the role that women play in the military, and it does nothing to encourage them. There's no career path, for example, for women, in a very similar way to what we were hearing earlier about the police force in Thailand. Women in Russia are under regulation in the military that they have to retire at the age of 40. And that's the age at which men are just beginning to move up through the ranks and get some serious experience and get some serious seniority. Now, many of the women who are still in the Russian military are told, oh, don't worry about that. We won't pay any attention to that. But of course, it's always hanging over their head. And if anything should go awry with their careers, they can always be told, oh, look, we didn't notice you passed your 40th birthday. Well, out you go. All right, so this is very, very typical. So it's gender is really important for Russia. It's not marginal, it's not peripheral, but it's absolutely vital to the way that Russia sees itself and the way that it presents itself to the world, because Russia presents itself as the bastion of traditional social values, not only to its own society, but it is making a big plea, it has been for several years now, even before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It's making a big plea to the world, particularly the global south, as the leader of traditional social values. And that means not only keeping women in their place, but it also means discrimination against LGBTQ people. It means a very, very strict gender order, which cannot be challenged if Putin is going to have the sort of state which he wants to. And moreover, and just in conclusion, I would say that this is also one of the ways that Putin and his regime defined Russia in contrast to Ukraine. So Putin will say, oh, those Ukrainians, they have no moral values, they have no moral compass, they don't understand the roles of men and women, they're degenerate and all these kinds of things. So all of this sort of casting slurs against Ukrainian society because of gender issues, because Ukrainian society is much more welcoming to LGBTQ people, because it's much more invested in gender equality. So it's a really important defining characteristic for Russia, and I think it also helps to define and determine the way that they are fighting the war. I think it has a lot to do with the brutality that we've seen, which has been exhibited by many of the Russian soldiers, and a lot of the horrible war crimes that we've seen as well. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much to our speakers here present in person. Of course, also Anna Kvit very kindly joined us via the recording. So we're going to start with the informal conversation. I'm aware of timekeeping, so we will open it up for discussions to everyone after that as well. But building on some of the points that Jennifer, you very kindly mentioned right now about, in quotation marks, traditional social values, traditional associations of what it means to be a man or a woman. So this is a question which, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you in reverse chronological order of your presentations, each of you to comment on how, in your two cases, the invasion of Ukraine, in your case perhaps with reference to Georgia or any other kind of theoretical background, how has war changed perceptions of femininity and masculinity, or what it means to be a man or a woman? Perhaps if we start, because you mentioned some of those points.
Okay. I would say it hasn't necessarily changed perceptions among society in Russia, but it has changed the way that the regime, the state, presents those roles. And one of the interesting things about the military recruitment campaign, the video, the picture that I showed you from, is that this appeal to masculinity was not particularly successful, because Russia has a real crisis of military recruitment at the moment, and the appeals to masculinity do not work. What works is offering more money. That is what has proven to be much more effective. Similarly, although women are repeatedly marginalized in the public discourse and basically told they should be supportive wives and mothers and stay at home and look after the children, in fact, Russian women do an enormous amount of work. And when the men are taken for the military, it's the women who are picking up all the pieces in civil society. And so I don't think it's necessarily changed the way that ordinary Russians view masculinity and femininity, but it has changed the rhetoric of the state.
Interesting. So again, coming back to these regime dynamics that you mentioned about certain legitimacy discourses and how important gender is in the Putin regime. Very interesting. Marianna, in the case of Ukraine, perhaps also your own experience.
Yeah, Anna told us, and I would like to confirm that Ukraine has a very strong and effective state policy on assuring of gender equality. And our government continued to implement even during the war this policy. I can say that our society became, as for me, more egalitarian. I can tell that women became more stronger. Really, they are ready to do absolutely everything to stop this war. From another side, I can see some changes in the behavior of men. At this time, they can express their need, for example, for psychological support. And also, we can see many examples where, for example, a woman, a wife, is serving in armed forces or some police unit, and her husband takes care of the children. And for our society, it's absolutely normal. It was the decision of one's family, and we really have many examples of such families, as in police, as the same in the armed forces.
Would you say, maybe just a really brief follow-up question then, that these were dynamics in favor of gender equality that the war has exacerbated in a sense? Okay.
It was a little bit a result of all gender policy, and it's a result of the war.
Very interesting. Anna, perhaps with reference to Georgia and thinking also about, you mentioned the 3 war experiences, do you think that had any impact on perceptions of masculinity and femininity?
Sure, and 2 points. One, I would only agree from observing people who are the faces of Ukraine's war effort, that there is a really great representation of women there. I just met head of the Foreign Affairs Committee of Ukrainian Parliament. There, just from the outside, there are very many women at many levels who speak on behalf of the state and have no problem. So I'm not speaking about combat. In Georgian, so in the Georgian Ministry of Defense, in terms of numbers, for example, in the civilian section, the number of women, so when I arrived at the ministry, it was to my surprise that the number of women is even bigger than of men in the civilian section of Ministry of Defense. So 60% are women. And I have my own personal, not research-based explanations why this happened. NATO has a lot to do with it. If you're NATO affiliated, NATO programs, NATO quotas, speaking English, all of this, also you have to meet certain criteria. All of this really helps to represent women better. But to go back to your question about war, so Georgia comes, this is why I spoke about winning a lot. Georgia has been an object of lost wars, and it's terrible. So the impact of that, consecutively losing wars because the antagonist on the side is Russia, and the construction of narrative around lost wars is worse, then this is why I said even if you are not winning, the narrative about what's going on with you is very important, because the Georgian narratives are about lost wars. And the effect of that on gender, a lot has been written, has been very bad. So resignation of men, mass feeling of guilt, mass feeling of responsibility, like depression, resignation from the roles, addictions, violence. There's a lot of studies, including psychological studies on this. On the good side of that, empowering of women has happened. So women have taken some of the spaces which have been emerged as gaps in terms of also family responsibility and responsibility externally, taking economic roles, much more serious economic roles. The problem with that is that understanding of cultural change, of change roles, is slow. So it's only now, it's been 30, 20 years after this conflict, it's only now there's discussion. So what is actually happening? So what is now the actual family arrangement, Georgian family arrangement? Is it the one that was in 1970s? Or is it when the mother in almost every family, one person, often a woman, mother, sister, works abroad, they're paying to sustain the family, right? So the reconfiguration of gender roles and understanding what has happened, it's only now, 15, 20 years later. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Thank you very much. And actually building on that, a follow-up question just to dig a little deeper. So there is, in theoretical debates, there is this phrase of everyday essentialism. And everyday essentialism says that we tend to assume that women are the gentler, more peaceful, weaker, as Jennifer was saying as well, sex, whereas men are naturally more aggressive, more suited not only to leadership roles, but also to, for instance, combat roles. And maybe building on the points you just mentioned, because exactly as you're saying, these kind of socially constructed narratives of stereotypes. I'm going to pass on the question to Marianna and Jennifer as well, but coming back to exactly what you were saying right now, would you say then in Georgia that this stereotype of women tend to be victims and men tend to be perpetrators of violence, does that persist despite, for instance, these acts of agency that you mentioned? Or?
I think it's changing very seriously. And also, as it happens, as gender roles are being, as all social roles are being reconfigured, there's more conflict. So in rural areas, our record of family violence is very bad. Recently, I've been advocated for reform. We need to do more in terms of femicide. In urban areas, it's easier. There's also more wealth in urban areas, and the reconfigure. But the roles have been seriously reconfigured. So in 2011, I wrote a piece. So that was 10 years ago. about lack of women's movement in Georgia, 2011, 10 years ago. Because you could be a politician, you could be on TV, and a male politician next to me said, mainstream air, he said, women have smaller brains, what to expect? And this was okay, 2011. And so I was mad and went and wrote this piece, like, where's women's movements? All these NGOs writing, getting grants, where's solidarity? 10 years now, no, it's not gonna, right? And you can't. There is not only pressure, but understanding reconfiguration of roles, changing male roles as well, stepping more in terms of family duties. Yeah, in rural areas it's more problematic, and the means of conflict resolution are not there to solve it more peacefully.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Marianna. Based also on your own experience, some of the numbers that you showed us, clearly women are acting as agents of security in Ukraine. But are the stereotypes still there, that women might not be quite as capable as their male counterparts?
Unfortunately, in this war, women are, from one side, the victims, and from another side, they are really the agents of security. If we talk about the victims, I can tell that, that Russian soldiers committed a large number of crimes against civilian population of Ukraine, men, women, and children. Especially sexual crimes were particularly internally. And it was a decision of the Ministry of Internal Affairs to create special police units, mobile units, that will to detect and document such crimes in different areas. Also, the police women officers that we can say are the agents of security were involved in these mobile groups because the better trust of women victims, women to them. That's why these mobile groups really done successfully work, and they continue to do it. And they have already checked 230 different locations. That's why we have such result. From one side, some part of women are victims, but from another side, we have a large number of agents of security.
Interesting, thank you very much. Passing it over to Jennifer. So do you think this hyper-masculinity that you were describing under the Putin regime, does that only leave space for these dichotomies?
I think there's huge everyday essentialism in Russia. I think, although I don't think the war has necessarily shifted perceptions of masculinity and femininity in Russia, they're already quite stark. And I could just give you the example of domestic violence. Domestic violence is a terrible problem in Russia, and it is not being addressed by law enforcement because the basis for addressing it, i.e. the law, has been rolled back so that no longer is it a criminal offense to beat your wife. Right? You have to cause lasting damage, whatever that means. In practice, it probably means death. So it's very extreme. It's very serious.
Thank you very much. On that note, I'm glancing at Barbara. I know about time because there needs to be the overall conclusion as well. If we take 7 minutes, is that okay? Yeah? Yeah, 10 minutes as planned? Yeah, okay, perfect. Then herewith, I already saw one hand at least was raised, opening it up to the floor.
Yes.
So then,
and there may be questions online.
I just wanted to,
yeah, absolutely.
I just wanted to congratulate the
I just
panelists
need the mic.
on the beautiful interventions. Thank you, Marianna, for the beautiful overview related to women's discourse in Russia. I just wanted to thank you, the panelists, for the beautiful interventions. Thank you, Marianna, for giving us an overview of women in Ukrainian forces and military. I just wanted to ask you the question related to the rise of domestic violence in Ukraine during the war. And the second question would be, there's been prevalence of gender and sexual-based violence during the armed conflict in Ukraine, and I wonder how Ukrainian authorities have approached qualifying and investigating these cases domestically. Thank you.
I just can tell absolutely honestly that domestic violence, it was the problem in Ukraine, and this problem still exists. And due to the war in Ukraine, the number of cases really increased. In the Department of the National Police that responsible for the preventive work, also there are special units that are working with these types of crimes. It's from another side, it's like these mobile groups that fight against, that document and record their sexual crimes. And we have the same units in the preventive department that violate domestic crimes. It's also a problem in our system because everyone is stressed and really the number of cases is much bigger. And second one question was concerning
Rape and sexual
rape
during war, yeah?
It's difficult questions because our main investigative department is deal with these questions. I represent the International Police Cooperation Department. Yeah, unfortunately, it's better if we can discuss these questions maybe another time, because it's the information of Special Investigation Department, how they investigate these rapes during the war. Yeah.
But it's a very interesting question because, for instance, last year the UN put out a special report where it was explicitly said we do not need to have hard data in order to construct a humanitarian response to wartime sexual violence against men, women, boys, girls, and people of all gender identities. So it's a very relevant question, of course. Thank you. I think, yeah.
I was just going to probably carry on around a bit. So, what the Ministry of Interior in Ukraine are doing a lot, they're working a lot with international agencies on and learning from other international experts around these sexual violence and conflict. So they're putting in a lot of work for investigators, training them up and getting them ready. And the other thing that certainly the UN agencies as well, UN Women, are looking to work with the Ministry of Interior, we touched on domestic violence, is that recognition that we know domestic violence goes up during times of conflict, but we also know it goes up when the conflict immediate aftermath, because those military personnel will go back to their homes, they're coming from a conflict environment, domestic violence will go up. So they're also positioning themselves ready for that. And I think that's another thing that Ukraine are leading the way on, because often, as many of us in this room know, that sort of peace building, that back to normality normally comes after the conflict is finished. But the Ukrainian government are working now in readiness for the victory, which
Thank you, Jane. I just want to add a few words. You know that before the war, we really didn't have the experience how to investigate any war crime. It was something incredible for us, but the number of such crimes are so big, and our investigators should done it quickly. When our colleagues from Europe and other states to come to Ukraine in March, in April, maybe in the end of spring of 2022, they really start to help us with trainings. For example, European Union Advisory Mission, you know this organization, and they include very different experts from different countries and with very good experience in the investigation of such crimes. And they started to train our investigators how to investigate these different types of crimes, because it was really the challenge for everyone investigators what to do, how to do, and this all this will be the evidence in the international court.
Thank you very much. You've got a question? Sorry.
Very quick, I promise. None of you talked about the numbers of widows and wives of the missing, these wars, whether it were in Russia or Georgia or Ukraine. And we had a Ukrainian widow on a webinar we did about widows the other week, and she was saying that there's so many women who they've now set up a sperm bank in Ukraine because these women whose husbands are going to war want to have their children. But my question is, with so many women who migrated as refugees and left, is that also somehow increasing men who don't have women? Is there more abuse? Is there more prostitution because the women aren't there? And yet the women who've gone alone as refugees are now having a women incredibly strong. So is that going to sort of somehow change the relations even after the war, when these women are alone looking after their children, and then what happens to their marriages? Thank you.
And perhaps that is a question for Anna, because you mentioned something about trauma and intergenerational effects.
Yeah, I can tell you Georgian statistics are quite bad. So if you are, I mean, this is funny, but if you are a 40-year-old woman to get married in Georgia to a Georgian, the chances are very slim. This is pure statistics. I investigated this for a friend of mine who was dating. And I said, okay, I'm a researcher, let me figure this out. So I went into National Statistics Department, pulled it up. Of course, this is the war generation, right? So 40 and up, you will see. So when they're 20, it's 1-to-1, or 20, 15, 1-to-1 in terms of gender. 40 and up, women, the number of women increases, the number of, I don't remember the numbers, but it's horrible. So maybe like 4-to-1 or so. So this is all, that's just my musing. It's not, science, but it's all the, 3 wars, right? And then the repercussions of the war and the impact of it. First, actually fighting, and then coming back, no economy, finding no role for you. As father of the family, you have much more responsibility than everybody else. So that's even more pressure. So that's suicide rates, quite terrible. I used to know they're quite bad. So and there's a lot of mental health kind of work that needs to be done to deal with the repercussions. Yeah.
I just want to confirm absolutely the same situation is in Ukraine. Really, it's the tragedy of the nation and another generations. Because when children grows up without their parents, mother or father, it will have the result for another generation. It's a very difficult situation, but and we will have these results not nearest 10 years. I think that more and more.
And maybe, if I may, just quickly to involve Jennifer as well in that question. So coming back to the recruitment video that you mentioned earlier. So in Russia, would you say the general perception is one of men are disposable? So maybe there are sperm banks as an alternative. So if they die, that's it?
I don't know that the answer to that question about the sperm banks. I have to say I haven't looked at that, but certainly, I mean, if you think about the practice of recruiting from the prisons, which is certainly a very widespread when it comes to private military companies, but also I think we're seeing it for the military as well. Those prisoners who serve it's usually 6 months or some period of time and survive, all of them do, and return, are now committing terrible crimes when they come back in their communities. So murder and all kinds of terrible crimes. So there's that aspect of those who come back, as well as the questions about what happens with the families of those who do not. And the Ministry of Defense in Russia is very bad at keeping track of their soldiers. And so sadly, many of the families whose sons, husbands, fathers have died in the war, don't have that final confirmation. They don't have a body to bury and to mourn. They don't have that closure either. So there's another element, I think, of trauma that happens there.
Just a few words. You told about the prisoners. We know about Wagner. And when we talk the situation on this issue between my friends, we usually tell that from Russia sides are died prisoners. Not only prisoners, but the most part of prisoners. But from our side are died the best representatives of our nation, and it's really tragedy.
Barbara very kindly reminded me that we have only time for one more question. I'm just wondering, sorry, I don't know whether I'm looking into the right direction. Is there online any question that we should pick up on? If anybody has, no, nothing online. So we have time for one more question in the room.
Round of questions. Any hands? Everyone is tired.
I can ask a final question. Sorry, but I thought the questions earlier about wartime sexual violence were very interesting, and of course also what you were mentioning about the response. Maybe, Jennifer, if you don't mind, if we start with you. Do you think Russian forces are using it strategically as a weapon?
Oh yes, there's no doubt.
We have a lot of evidence in terms of intercepted communications from Russian soldiers back to their families, back to other people, communications among the soldiers. It is definitely something which is being done strategically. It's being done with intention. This isn't something that just spontaneously happens. This is absolutely aimed at not only damaging and sort of hurting Ukrainian women, but also damaging the society as a whole. And there's a genocidal element to it as well, trying to impregnate women to bear Russian children, for example. So yes, it is absolutely intentional.
I can just add that, that this violence were against all possible category of our population: elderly, men, women, children, and especially small children. And they just absolutely sure that there will be no punishment for them, and they just do everything that they want.
Thank you very much. And of course that goes back to Anna's earlier points about the relevance of law and order and the need to pay attention to how it's being reconstructed after the violent conflict has ended. And Marianna, as you very kindly were saying, hopefully it's not going to last much longer. Fingers crossed. Thank you so much for your very insightful comments.